What really worries me today is what's going to happen to us if machines can think. And what interests me specifically is, can they?
Well, that's a very hard question to answer. If you'd asked me that question just a few years ago, I'd have said it was very far-fetched. And today, I just have to admit I don't really know.
Well, if you're confused, Doctor, how do you think I feel?
This is AI for the Rest of Us, a podcast from University of Texas at Austin.
I'm Mark Earhart.
And I'm Casey Boyle.
This is a show that helps explain artificial intelligence, what it means, who it affects, and what you need to know right now.
I'm convinced that machines can and will think in our lifetime.
There is going to be all this automation. People are going to be out of work.
Computers are taking over now.
Here I am playing chess with a computer.
And then I just flick a switch on the modem and replace the receiver. I'm now waiting for the computer to answer me.
Today on AI for the Rest of Us.
There is a concern, both that we're running out of content and also that there's a lot of AI-generated content out there. The sort of snake eating its own tail where, we've replaced all the great human data with this crappier LLM-generated data.
Today, we're going to dive into the world of large language models, or LLMs, like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, and Claude. When they came onto the scene a couple of years ago, it felt like the future was suddenly here. Now, people use them to write wedding toasts, decide what to have for dinner, compose songs, and all sorts of writing tasks. Will these chatbots eventually get better than humans? Will they take our jobs? Will they lead to a flood of disinformation? And will they perpetuate the same biases that humans have always had?
Joining us to grapple with those questions is Greg Durrett, an associate professor of computer science at UT Austin. He's worked for many years in the field of natural language processing, or NLP, which aims to give computers the ability to understand human language. His current research is about improving the way LLMs work and extending them to do more useful things like automated fact-checking and deductive reasoning. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here, Greg.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to chat about it. It's an exciting time.
So when we refer to AI, a lot of times people are referring to what's called large language models, things like ChatGPT or the kinds of things we see in Google to help us write, or even on our phones, the predictive texting, that sort of thing. The question we want to ask you today is, what are large language models and how are they different from other kinds of AI that have been developed over the last 50 years or so?
Yeah, okay, we'll settle in because I can give you 30 minutes on that question.
Okay.
Let's get the short version.
Yeah, I'll give you the short version.
And then we'll expand it.
So what are LLMs? So large language models are large neural networks that are trained to predict what the most likely next word is to come after some series of words that we've already seen so far. And through some sort of additional training, they're taken to not just predict the most likely next word, but let's say also the most likely next word that's going to be useful, which is how ChatGPT kind of gives you a sort of nice response to your question rather than just some response. We can go into more on that, but let me just answer the other part first, which was how they differ from things that we've seen before. It's largely a question of scale. Some of the neural net technology, the transformer architecture, was developed in 2017, and so it's relatively new. But arguably, most of the ideas for it have been around for 50 years almost. And so the issue was just that a lot of the ingredients there don't really work until you have enough data, enough compute, enough GPUs to train these things at large scale. And that's part of what is really kind of surprising. And I think, at least for me, would have been hard to predict 10 years ago that we would be here today, is just how much that scaling really matters.
If you had to give a quick differentiation between the predictive texting we see in our phone versus the kinds of generative text creation we see in larger language models, what would be a quick differentiation there?
That's a really great example, actually, because in my Essentials of AI lecture, I actually talked about predictive texting as the sort of proto version of this stuff. Fundamentally, it's the same idea. The predictive texting has to fit on your phone and run very quickly. So it uses models that only look at, let's say, the last couple of words to try to figure out what's going to come next. Whereas a model like ChatGPT can look at hundreds of words that you type into your prompt, or even thousands of words, and then kind of assimilate all that information. There's also no way that would run on a phone. Just the amount of raw compute going into those processes is orders of magnitude larger.
Gotcha. So it's basically about computing power.
Yeah.
If the whole field and progress of AI were a pie, how big of a slice is LLMs within that pie?
It depends on where you are, I think. There's a phenomenon called Moravec's paradox, which is basically the sort of things that we think is hard for humans, like creative writing. Like in some sense, LLMs can kind of do that. Whether they do it well is another question.
Right.
And then things like picking up a water bottle is trivial for us, but is actually quite difficult still for robots to be able to do consistently. So I think if you talk to my roboticist colleagues, they're like, well, that's all great, but like my robot still can't like do everyday household tasks for you. And LLMs are impacting robotics somewhat, but it's like evolution rather than revolution. Like
Gotcha.
It's not clear how much that's going to change. On the other hand, for a lot of knowledge worker style applications, like, helping with content creation or editing or things like that, they do seem like a much bigger paradigm shift. Software engineering as well.
So I'm curious, people have been working for decades to get models that can do this kind of language generation and asking questions in a kind of sophisticated way. Why is it that LLMs were the thing that were suddenly able to do this thing that was so hard for people to figure out how to do it? I mean, it seems to have come out of nowhere for most of us who weren't paying attention to artificial intelligence. What is it about LLMs that makes them, so powerful?
It's two things, really. One is the size of the neural net architecture, and in some ways just the audacity that folks at OpenAI and Google and elsewhere had to scale these things to the extent that they were being scaled. It really now seems like a lot of other kind of different types of neural net architectures can work the same way as the transformer for these types of tasks, but just none of it had been tried at this large scale before. The other thing is that language modeling as a task, which is this predict the next word task, really has this sort of beautiful property. It was articulated in this paper called Scaling Laws for Language Models, that the more data you get, your model just smoothly gets better according to many measures, which is just not true for a lot of tasks. Like if I'm training a bot to classify a movie review as positive or negative, I need to see 1,000 movie reviews to do a good job at that. But seeing 1 million movie reviews won't move the needle very far after I see 1,000. But language modeling, it does seem like, just the more of the web you see, and if we had 10 times more text on the web than we have right now, these things would do even better. We just somehow haven't hit that limit. And that's, I'd say, the pretty remarkable property. Because, again, a lot of the technology was even developed for other things like translation. Translation is just, it doesn't lead to the same kind of explosive capabilities as something like ChatGPT, even though you can build a really good translation system.
You mentioned audacity of some of these folks who have, since 2017 have been throwing a lot of energy and thought and imagination towards these systems. Is there a downside to that audacity?
I think from a scientific perspective, it's good to know what's possible. And I think that the progress is certainly enabled by people taking risks and saying, we're going to build these at larger scale than they've been built before. Mm-hmm. So I guess ultimately there's this whole separate debate about whether you think that the changes that are coming are good or bad or not. It's kind of too soon to say, but also a little bit outside my purview.
Yeah, I totally understand that. Totally understand that. But I had to follow up. The audacity, sure. Like as a humanist over here, I hear audacity. I'm like, oh, that's like half of all literature, right? So I had to follow that one.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I say audacity is just because you're throwing a lot of resources after something that didn't necessarily have a very strong chance of working out. Like I think many people, I can wind the clock back to 2016. Which was before really there were the first inklings of these sort of results. And I could have told you all the arguments for why it wouldn't have worked, and I would have had some fairly convincing evidence on my side.
Absolutely.
Too.
One of the things that a lot of people have noticed with things like ChatGPT, it wants to please you, right? It wants to say something coherent, but often it will make up things. It'll fabricate things. If you ask about some factual thing in the world, it'll hallucinate, it'll lie, it'll just do whatever it takes to write a nice piece of text. Do you see a way forward with that? I mean, it seems to me like that's maybe an impediment to it actually being useful for, work and education, things like that. What's sort of the outlook there?
Yeah, it's a very interesting and sort of tricky question, and one that my group is doing a lot of research on is kind of how do we combat hallucinations? Where do they come from? Things like that. I think there's a couple of elements here. One is that these do get a bit better with scale. Like there's a lot of evidence in sort of the first ChatGPT that came out, things were pretty bleak. And then with GPT-4, even a few months later, and some of the improvements since then, it smoothed out a lot of rough edges. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it does seem like we're still in a phase of reducing the error rate to some extent. There's also way to build systems in a way that makes this kind of less of a problem in some sense. One example is in some fact-checking work we've looked at. Basically, we're trying to build tools to allow LLMs to help human fact-checkers kind of sift through all the information they might find about a political claim. There's a lot of ways to build those tools to try to help people. One way would just be like you give the claim to a system and say, is this true or not? And that kind of thing will lead to hallucination, speculation, all this stuff. Another way is to use the LLMs to crunch the data that's kind of already there. And if you set that up in the right way, you'll get something that is kind of much more grounded in some existing data or text. This is also the difference between ChatGPT and something like the Bing chat agent or the things that happen when you go to the Google agent as well. They retrieve stuff from the web and then they use the LLM to kind of summarize that for you, which is much, much less likely to kind of pull in other information, although it's not impossible. It can take stuff out of context. It can kind of mix things together that weren't meant to be mixed together and give you the wrong connotation about stuff. So there are still all kinds of risks, but it's not the same level of just like, oh, it says that up is down kind of thing.
Is there much research on how to like have multiple LLMs working together to, one generates text, the other one sort of evaluates how truthful it is, kind of working together?
Yeah, this is something that we're very actively working on. There's a bunch of work from, I think just a number of different academic and industry groups on basically the idea of you get some response from ChatGPT, you break it down into a bunch of pieces, you take each of those pieces and you try to find evidence to substantiate it on the web. You then kind of either revise the thing that you wrote or you give the user a report like, oh, this statement maybe that the LLM made was not quite as solid as it could have been. So there's a very sort of detail oriented kind of like pull apart every like minute thing and try to validate it. There's challenges with that because, if something's sort of 95% correct, and then you come through and you try to check every single piece of it, you might get some false positives or, there might be something that's right, but sort of you can get into like levels of nuance and be like, well, technically, but then going well technically about, every statement and something that basically gives you the right idea isn't always the right thing either. One other sort of wild thing that people are doing, which I'm actually very skeptical of as a research direction, is people are trying to take multiple LLMs and give them different personas and have them engage in debate with each other.
Oh, interesting.
So the idea is that you tell, and it can even be the same language model. It can be the same ChatGPT. You tell it, okay, you're going to play the role of, the moderator in a political debate, and you're going to play the role of the left-wing candidate, and you're going to play the role of the right-wing candidate. Then you have the moderator ask a question and have each one. I mean, this gets to the idea of sometimes what they generate is fairly trite, and I actually haven't seen a lot of really kind of insightful or interesting things come out of this, but it is sort of sometimes a way to get some interesting different results of the computation out.
It strikes me as no different than the kinds of trite we get from those particular debates anyways.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So you're saying we could replace politicians with LLMs?
I mean, that's certainly what some people would say, but
I would count that as a win for AI there.
I think one thing that LLMs have shown us in that, we haven't laid off massive sectors of society is that even though we think about writing as an end, but writing is also largely a means to an end. It's a way of formulating thought and also kind of, mediating communication between different groups, for example. Like, if you're going to go in and take a meeting and then write an email to someone that's like, here's what I think we need to do after that meeting, the actual process of composition is not really the bottleneck there. Just like how I don't think typing 80 words per minute versus 40 words per minute makes you like twice as effective as an employee at almost any job.
Right.
So yeah, again, like just because it could do the form of the thing, sometimes that cuts it, but most of the time not.
Right. And I mean, as a writing instructor and someone who studied this stuff, the process, and you're hinting towards that, the process of doing it itself is what hones the thought rather than just having the form being signaled and whatnot. I want to switch gears a second. There are concerns that LLMs will make it easier for bad actors to spread disinformation online. I understand you're a part of a project within the university's Good Systems Initiative that's trying to use LLMs to actually help combat disinformation by assisting human fact checkers. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so let me engage the two parts separately.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Are LLMs going to lead to widespread disinformation? I think my answer is a definite maybe. The reason to not be super pessimistic about it would be that already it's the case that Russia has a lot of resources. They can hire a lot of people to sit there and post comments on social media trying to stir up the American political system, right? Mm-hmm. It can be automated and improved, but there's already like state level resources going into that. It's not clear that like someone sitting in their basement trying to use LLMs to do the same thing is necessarily going to be more disruptive than an existing state actor like Russia.
Yeah.
And then how can LLMs help? Well, I think like the main promise they have is just being able to sift through information and make sense of it more quickly. So when you start to see this kind of misinformation out there, it's easier to both allow human fact checkers to dig through the kind of archives of what's been checked before or scientific literature on something and like put together a response to it more quickly than they would have before. It hasn't fully materialized yet, but that's the hope. However, the kind of wrinkle there is that it's not necessarily the case that misinformation is solved by taking the false claim on social media and just sticking the sort of footnote after it, which is like, hey, this isn't necessarily true.
Right.
A lot of my colleagues on the Good Systems project, like Joe Lukido and Dheeraj Murthy, look at the ways that things spread in social media and basically how this process unfolds. And trying to interject the truth in there is only one tactic to understand and combat it.
Yeah, I did a small project on some of the Facebook stuff from the lead up to the 2016 election, and most of it wasn't disinformation. It was just trying to amplify affinity groups' identification with one another and to kind of calcify and to reify the boundaries between that group and a different group. There's been a lot of criticism, and rightly so, about how the models that LLMs are trained on are exclusive or replicate some of the same kinds of exclusions we see in wider society. So a lot of the texts are centered around, predominantly, let's say, white, Western kinds of text. And so what gets created is and repeated is that culture and those texts and those values and those kinds of things, which also repeats the same kinds of exclusions of anybody outside of those groups. So what measures are being taken to address these issues and shortcomings?
So there's two stages when LLMs get trained. The first is what's called the pre-training stage, where you just dump the entire web into it or as closely as you can.
Right.
Thinking about what data goes in there is something that a lot of people are doing. There's not an easy answer. I mean, if you look at the relative sizes of different Wikipedias, for example, you can get a sense already that like there's going to be a lot more English out there than a lot of other languages, right? And so there is this kind of perspective skew there. On the other hand, a lot of what causes ChatGPT to output a response is also an element of the second stage, which is the fine-tuning stage, which kind of uses various different methods to make these systems output something that's more helpful. So I think what's not clear is like, let's say on the web, you see something that's, 80% the kind of Western perspective and 20% a mix of other perspectives. Naively, you might think, oh, you ask ChatGPT, it's going to give you the Western one because it's just more prevalent. It does seem like the alignment or fine-tuning process has some ability to balance between that and provide multiple perspectives. Now, I think if you're 99.99% and 0.001%, at some point it just becomes impossible to surface that. So if it's just not there in the data at all, you can't deal with it. So there's work about thinking about this. And I honestly, a large part of where we are right now is just measurement. So there's work out of a group at University of Washington, Yejin Choi's group, about how to measure the kind of values encoded in LLMs and how to even kind of articulate this and think about it. There's a lot of work to measure it. There are some tools that we have to deal with it, but as far as I know, there's not a really accepted solution for what's going to happen. And I would say that it's not even easy to come to a solution to the extent that there's having the large language model, but then if you're OpenAI, you also have a product, right? And it is a choice as a product to make something that says like, when given a question, should euthanasia be legal or something like that? What perspectives do you provide? How do you balance those? How much airtime do you give to both sides? Like it's very much the same kind of thing that the, human-run media has to deal with. I don't think there's a right answer.
I'm curious where you see LLMs going in terms of their potential over the next, 5-10 years. If you could look in your crystal ball, what do you see coming down the road in terms of these LLMs?
There's one sort of view, which is that there's going to be this kind of exponential takeoff and we're going to get to, LLMs and robots that destroy the world, basically, because once they get to the point where they can improve themselves and generate data that they can train on and sort of self-improve, there might be this kind of feedback loop. I don't think we've seen a lot of evidence for that. And I think instead it looks more like a kind of a sort of tapering off and plateauing sort of effect. Now, I mean, the thing that makes it challenging is that, it's easy to look at what's there right now and kind of measure a taper off and a plateau. But to some extent, like the way that this progresses is more about science of science. Like how many more kind of breakthroughs do we expect to see? And how much are those going to elevate that plateau?
Right.
I don't know. My bet is that we're still going to see some fairly major improvements, particularly around some of the stuff like hallucination or factuality. Like I think in a year or two, the types of conversations we'll be having around that will be very different. Mm-hmm. I don't think that we're going to get another, like I think now that we have the kind of current GPT-4 quality stuff, I don't think we're going to get something that like looks as much better than that as we've seen in the past. I think it's going to look more incremental. And maybe after a bunch of incremental things, we look back and say, hey, it looks like we've come a long way. But I don't know. I think the transformations are likely to be more gradual and likely to be as a result of taking this and figuring out ways to actually put it into practice.
So you don't see it as being like a Moore's law kind of thing where every 18 months it's going to be twice as powerful, and it's going to, in the way that computer chips become faster and more powerful every 18 months.
I think we are in that period, but I think what's a little bit hard to say is when we're going to saturate on the kinds of benchmark data sets and benchmark tasks that we're using and how we even sort of measure progress beyond that. I think there comes a point where, yes, it's able to kind of memorize the internet a little bit more efficiently, and you can make it a bit smaller and a bit faster at doing that. Like, I think that's the extent to which I think the Moore's Law thing holds, where I think, in a few years, are we going to have something that's 2 times better than what's there currently, according to some measure, and then, 3 times smaller? I think it's possible. But what impact is that actually going to have, and how is that going to transform society? I think that's what's a little bit harder to say.
Are we running out of content for training LLMs on? And does that mean that we're getting close to maxed out in terms of their sophistication?
There is a concern, both that we're running out of content and also that there's a lot of AI-generated content out there.
Yeah.
The Ouroboros is the thing that gets invoked, the sort of snake eating its own tail, where we've replaced all the great human data with this crappier LLM generated data. And there's been some work showing that training LLMs on their own data kind of leads them to these feedback loops that are really kind of not productive. So there's definitely a concern about the quality of the data. And yes, to some extent, we're hitting that point. I think that it's going to be about kind of work smarter, not harder, in some sense, where, I mentioned, there's this fine-tuning phase where you figure out how to get what you want out of the LLM. I think a lot of the information is out there, at least when we're talking about English. I think there's a lot of cultures and communities in the world that aren't on the, internet, or there's just not much text out there, and kind of reaching them and building tools for them is a whole separate issue. But, if we're just talking about English or sort of very widely spoken languages with millions, billions of speakers, those are ones where it's all out there. There's a lot of stuff out there, and I think we can get better things just by being smarter about it.
Do you think working with languages that are not English, is that going to be a priority for companies and researchers because of this kind of market logic behind a lot of these applications?
As far as I know, Google, they do care about languages other than English, but there's sort of this top 40 they really care about. Then there's a long, long tail of there's around 6,000 languages, I think, spoken in the world today. Most of those, Google is not, they're not moving a lot of ad money or whatever. So it's not a priority as much. There's a lot of academic work that is interested, and this is a tradition all the way from kind of documentary linguistics to, people in NLP who maybe come from these communities, to people who are just kind of interested in how we broaden the scope of languages that these tools can serve. So there's definitely research. I would describe it as a priority. It's not the current flashiest thing that's getting the most attention, but there's absolutely a lot of work going on.
It seems like there could be a lot of kind of cross-disciplinary projects based around that, because as you solve problems for English-based languages and text, and including those in LLMs, different kinds of problems are going to come up with different languages, depending on the scripts, depending on the text, the corpus that they're using to digitize. So that seems kind of exciting to me. One last question. What's happening here at UT about AI that people should know about?
LLMs are a thing that's kind of transformative across many disciplines. UT is a leading research university across almost every discipline, I think. And so there's people in all corners of campus advancing stuff. I could speak a little bit to what's going on in computer science, where we have, people looking at the application side of things, people looking at building these out for robotics, people looking at the theory behind them. And there's even too many people there to name. There's probably 20 folks in my department I could rattle off real quick. So I think there's a big period of understanding how this new transformative technology is going to impact things. And that's still very much being digested, but I think everyone is playing a part in that digestive process.
Gotcha. Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. It was a really good conversation, and we're looking forward to seeing what you're coming up with next.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you for having me.
That's our show. Next time on AI for the Rest of Us.
We may need to rethink some of the ways that we're assessing our students so that we're not just spitting a ChatGPT generated lesson plan at them and they are spitting something back at us.
I'm actually excited about what this is going to do to college education.
AI for the Rest of Us is a production of the University of Texas at Austin's College of Natural Sciences and College of Liberal Arts. Our show is part of the university's Year of AI. To learn more, visit yearofai.utexas.edu.
For links and more resources on today's topic, go to aifortherest.net.
Big thanks today to our guest, Greg Durrett. Our executive producers are Christine Sinatra and Dan Oppenheimer. Sound design and audio editing by Robert Scaramuccia. Our theme music is by Aeolus Rue. Our interviews are recorded by the trusty audio engineers at the Liberal Arts ITS Recording Studio.
Thanks for listening.